Morning, guys. We're on Hebrews chapter 9, reading from verse 6. Now, when these things have been so prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. And so we're just looking at the Old Testament, and specifically the high priest as he entered into the holy place. That was the outer court, and then he would then once a year go into the inner court, which is the most holy place, or through a curtain, to make atonement for the sins of himself and also for the sins of the people. And he would offer a sacrifice of a bull. And so talking about these priests going in, it says, now when these things have been so prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer court, performing the divine worship. And so they have to continually, because people keep sinning, they have to keep on doing these things, whereas Jesus was a once for all sacrifice. He paid for the sins of the cross by dying for us, and it doesn't have to be repeated continually. It's interesting to notice that word divine worship is mentioned in Romans 12 verse 1 regarding us as laying our lives down as a spiritual act of worship. And under the new covenant, because of what Christ has done, we now lay our lives down, just like he laid his life down for us. We daily carry our cross, we die to the flesh, and so in that sense we lay our lives down for him, and that's an act of worship, a spiritual act of worship. Verse 7, but into the second only the high priest enters once a year. That's the most holy place, where the tabernacle is and the cherubim, and where God's presence is in the Old Testament, where the cloud came down and the presence of God was in that most holy place. He could only enter, it says, once a year. Whereas now, under the new covenant, because of what Jesus has done, we can enter in any time. We can pray to God, enter into his presence. There's no longer this veil that separates us from God because of the sin. And so, in another sense, in each time the Hebrew writer is explaining why the new covenant and why Christ is the better, far greater covenant, and how we mustn't hold on to the old. Not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. And blood was always, without the shedding of blood, there was no remission of sins. So blood had to be shed to pay for sins, and that's why Christ's blood had to be paid for the sins of us. Going on to verse 8, the Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not been disclosed while the outer tabernacle is still standing. And so, as we know, the Holy Spirit came. The Holy Spirit now lives in us, whereas under the Old Covenant, the Holy Spirit was with them. The Holy Spirit changes us from within, gives us a new heart, an ability to have those commandments written on our hearts and our minds, whereas under the Old Covenant, it's very much the letter of the law. And there's very similar, this is around about AD 70 when the temple, the whole system was destroyed. This is round about when this book of Hebrews was written, because it goes on to say, disclosed while the outer tabernacle is still standing. Verse 9, which is a symbol of the present time, according both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make the worshipper perfect in conscience. And so none of these things could make the worshipper perfect. And they knew it even in their conscience. They couldn't keep on doing these things. It never was enough. The blood of goats and lambs, and it just never fully paid the price for their sin. And so as it goes, we go down, and we'll read this a bit later on in Hebrews 9. It talks about these being dead works that don't clear the conscience. Whereas now we enter with a clear conscience, knowing that Christ has done a full, perfect sacrifice, and that it's a complete work, it's a sufficient work on the cross, and there is nothing needed, and it's nothing needed to add to it or subtract from it. And in so that sense, we have an absolute clear conscience when we come before God, knowing that every single sin has been dealt with by Jesus. Verse 9, which is a symbol of the present time according to both gifts and sacrifices, making the worshipper perfect in conscience. Verse 10, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of the Reformation. So again, these things were just to do with eating the right food, clean food, ceremonial washings, washing the outward. And as we know, it's not what goes in defiles you, it's what comes from the heart. So everything from the old covenant was really external, wasn't it? Whereas Christ is interested in changing the inner man, in making you a child of God. You're saved from within. You're a new creature. And that's why they talk about the heart and the mind being transformed. And so very much under the new covenant, God's doing a work in our hearts and changing us from within. Whereas a lot of these things are just like external. So they were symbols of us needing to be cleaned, needing to be washed, needing to be dealt with and completely, which came about when Jesus died on the cross. Amen.